Ahoy! It's your old buddy Hambone back again with a coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month's code is RPG City, good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, and it's running now through Saturday, July 31st. And before you check out, be sure to visit Noble Knight's newly launched gaming hall, which is the spot if you're looking for fresh gaming content brought to you by our friends at Noble Knight Games. Noble Knight's Gaming Hall is a great resource to find the latest info about conventions, new releases, tabletop gaming news, and so much more. You'll even find adventures, articles, game tutorials, and unboxing videos, all made for you by Noble Knight. You can access Noble Knight's Gaming Hall on the website or by visiting play.nobleknight.com. And don't forget to use the code RPGCity for 10% off orders of $10 or more, now through Saturday, July 31st, from our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. Today, we're going to talk about the Monster Manual, but I thought we did that already. Didn't we? Stu Horvath.
Hi, Hambone.
Hey, buddy.
What's going on?
Nothing much, man. I'm a little bit confused because I thought we did this episode already.
So, yeah, well, I mean, the Monster Manual in 1977 was D&D's first book of monsters, but it wasn't the first role-playing game book of monsters.
Really?
Yeah. Our friends over at Chaosium beat them to the punch by a couple months.
What a twist. Was their book actually called The Monster Manual?
No, it's called All the World's Monsters.
Oh, that's actually pretty cool.
It is. It's a good title.
I think it's a better title.
Yeah, I do too. I think it's got a little bit of panache, you know? It feels like a movie.
It really does. Has a little more sparkle and jazz to it, and I like that.
What's the Godzilla with Destroy All Monsters? It's kind of like in that kind of similar vein, right?
Now, see, real quick, I got to say, Destroy All Monsters actually sounds like it'd be a good name for like a monster compendium, but I digress.
So the idea behind All the World's Monsters was that Chaosium was going to sort of collect monsters that were created by other people. So like maybe something comes up in Different Worlds magazine or Space Gamer or from fanzines, Alarums and Excursions. Anything that has a D&D monster that's going to go in All the World's Monsters. It's right there in the title, right? Like everything. Dave Hargrave comes up with like some new thing for Arduin, stick it in All the World's Monsters. So that's the idea. It's like just a big user-generated, curated monster manual.
You mean back when everyone was a little more loosey-goosey with their IPs?
Yeah, you know, everybody was trying to do right by everybody.
Oh, of course. But, you know, nowadays, if you think like, oh, I want to take this monster from this and this monster from that, there's going to be some lawyers involved, dude.
Oh, yeah, totally. I think that's sort of one of the things that kind of like undoes the project ultimately. The other thing is just that there's too many monsters. There's just a tidal wave of D&D critters because there wasn't a monster manual, so everybody was making their own stuff up.
Isn't it funny that like the more we do this show, the more we find out how late to the party TSR was for all the stuff that's like really important to the game, like a monster manual.
It's so true. Like everything that we take for granted about D&D kind of happened later and had a little bit less impact than you would have thought. The thing is that TSR is always kind of like doing the thing that everybody else was doing once it was like a tried and proven way to make money and doing it with a little bit more budget. So because of delays on TSR's part, the Monster Manual in 1977 comes out later than it was expected. Just because of that, All the World's Monsters comes out first and becomes the first collection of monsters in a single monster book for role-playing games. This really bothers the folks over at TSR.
Well, yeah, I can imagine because, I mean, for all intents and purposes, during that time period, their move was always very roguish, where it's like, you go first. See how the trap gets set off when you walk across it, then I'll follow. However, something like this, like when you are building the foundation of the world's greatest role-playing game, to be behind the ball for the monster book, wow, that's a party foul, if you ask me.
So The other thing that kind of like in writing the book and the longer we talk about this stuff that surprises me is that nobody ever reads the forwards to these books. So the Monster Manual forward, Mike Carr writes it, and I'm going to read out loud the relevant passage because it's whew, salty. The success of Dungeons and Dragons has spawned a considerable number of imitations and spin-off products, perhaps inevitably. Some of these have merit. Many, however, do not. And although we may concede their right to exist, however dependent they may be upon D&D's audience, we would caution the prospective buyer to consider their true value and not to be confused with those items which bear the Dungeons and Dragons or Advanced Dungeons and Dragons name and constitute the official Dungeons and Dragons family of products. As for value, let the others be measured against the standard of quality we have striven for, a hardbound encyclopedia of monsters, for instance, as opposed to a low-quality collection, which is poorly assembled and bound.
Is his last name really Morton's? Because that was salty.
Right? Like, this is the flagship title of your new line, and you're gonna let Chaosium get under your skin like that?
Wow, that was a ungodly level of shade being levied at our friends over at Chaosium. Nowadays, they would be talking smack about things on Twitter, or probably they would know better because they have people who prevent them from doing such things, you know, unlike other companies that just run their mouths into the ground. But that's still like a level of like petty that is just breathtaking, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I found it really surprising when I actually finally read that after so many years. They don't mention Chaosium by name. There's no real surefire way of saying like that's what he was referencing unless we find him and ask him. But like the tail of the tape, it's right there. You got beat. And in fairness, All the World's Monsters is pretty low quality. It's a soft cover book. For some reason, it's printed horizontally. It's a typewritten manuscript that's sort of like photocopied.
So it's a zine.
But it's 8.5 by 11 size. It's almost as if like instead of printing the zine and folding the pages, they just bound the full pages, if that makes any sense.
So it's like a magazine.
Kind of. Fantastically illustrated cover, which has a very Virgil Finlay kind of like pulp style, but everything inside is very like sketch-tastic, kind of crappy illustrations.
Which we do recognize as the best. And that being said, we always recognize the cover is the bait.
It's true. And the monsters are pretty crappy. It's a bunch of like dumb, redundant, sort of like purposeless monsters. It's not a great selection, is what I'm saying. For what it is, it's sort of a novelty. I'm surprised there's 3 volumes of this. I figured after the first one, it would kind of petered out. All the World's Monsters also sort of marks Chaosium's entry into role-playing games. Like this is their first role-playing game product. They had been a war game maker until this point, and it's unusually shoddy for a Chaosium product, even an early one, you know?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's very interesting though, because the hobby does spin out of wargaming, and it's very kind of telling about where wargaming was at the time when so many are just kind of abandoning that ship and going into what has become traditional style role-playing games.
Yeah. Another historical footnote here is the second volume of All the World's Monsters reprints the Perrin Conventions. So All the World's Monsters is a project that was spearheaded by Jeff Pimper and Steve Perrin. Steve Perrin, he was a member of the Alarums and Excursions Amateur Press Association. Do you know what an Amateur Press Association is, Hambo?
If it's anything like the gang of dudes I used to roll with to make flyers for shows back in the 90s, then kinda. But theirs sounds so much more official.
It's basically a collection of zines that are sent to a central editor who binds them all together and then distributes them to the people on the mailing list who pay for the actual issues. It's a strange sort of thing. Alarums and Excursions started in 1974, and it basically has gone monthly ever since. It's an astounding feat of publishing.
Wait, it's still going today?
Yeah. Yeah. Lee Gold is still putting it out, as far as I know. Hundreds of issues. It's crazy. She's only missed like 4 or 5 months, and most of them were in the 70s.
Dude, if you can even remember the 70s, I would say that doesn't even count. That's a perfect record. Perfect attendance record, Lee Gold.
It kind of becomes a non-internet forum. People go back and forth. They kick around ideas. There's discussion kind of going on issue to issue. Becomes a sort of a hotbed for ideas, basically focused around fixing Dungeons and Dragons. D&D comes out. People are excited. And people are just like, well, yeah, but all of this stuff is wrong. So we need to fix it. That's sort of how A&E starts. And it continues in that mode. You know, in the 90s, a lot of 90s games come out of conversations that take place there too. But in the 70s, it's largely focused on D&D and sort of making D&D more playable. Again, this pisses off people at TSR. Gary Gygax had nothing nice to say about Alarums and Excursions after a certain point. I get it. It's hard to have like a whole publication dedicated to like talking about how you screwed up this awesome thing that you think is really good. So the Perrin Conventions are Steve Perrin's combat mechanics, a replacement combat system for D&D. You can use it really for anything. It sort of gets developed live in the pages of A&E month to month, I believe in 76. And it's off of this that sort of Perrin convinces Greg Stafford to kind of like entertain the idea of getting into role-playing games. And when Stafford really embraces this in 78 and decides like, okay, we're going to make a role-playing game for Glorantha and we're going to call it Runequest, he interviews a whole bunch of people to try and like put this thing together, and none of them work. And he goes to Steve Perrin and they connect, and the Perrin Conventions form the basis of Runequest, which another couple years later, Stafford sees Runequest as a very complex system, and he starts to see the need for something stripped down and basic. So they start developing basic role playing, him and Lynn Willis, and they basically take Runequest and they strip it down to the essentials, which basically is the Perrin Conventions. The Perrin Conventions is essentially basic role playing, from which all Chaosium games basically spring. And the first and only time I think that it ever sees print is in the second volume of All the World's Monsters.
Well, my mind's blown. I mean, you're telling this to me, and, you know, dear listener, you can't see the look on my face, but my jaw is dropped, and I'm like, where's he going to go next with this? And yet you stick the landing. You know, it's got to be weird to have like two sides of the coin. You got Greg, you got Gary. And you have Greg, who's kind of embracing all these different ideas that are spinning out of these zines and other places as the game is growing. And then you have Gary, who's like having to look at this as being like, okay, great, this is a whole magazine about how we love Dungeons and Dragons, but here's how to make it better. It's like, wow, like the level of criticism consistently levied at the originator and origins of the world's greatest role-playing game. That's crazy. Yeah. That is absolutely nuts. And you know what? Like, you think back in the day, you know, we talked about it on previous episodes, and I'm kind of hard-pressed to remember exactly which ones because we've done so many at this point. Oh, by the way, everybody, happy 3-year anniversary to us. This show has been on the air for 3 years now, and thank you all so much for listening. I keep forgetting to mention it because, you know, what is time anymore? However, it's always funny because, you know, we talk about how when the thing started, the big bang of RPGs, essentially, like everyone's cool. And, you know, you can write your adventure for this game and you could write your adventure for that game. And it's like any kind of company where it's like, yeah, man, it's cool. We'd be nothing without the fans. Like these people who are really getting behind us. We love you guys. We love you guys. Oh, wait, we're making less money. Cut off. And it's always interesting. It's always telling that even at the beginning, when the foundation's being built for the house, there really isn't a lot of room for other people to write their name on the sidewalk.
There's a very different mindset, and maybe getting kicked around in Alarums and Excursions kind of hardened Gygax in the early days and contributed to his alienation that I think fuels D&D in general. D&D always has positioned itself to be somehow cut off from the rest of the hobby, whereas like Chaosium has always been like right there in the middle of it and encouraging growth and experimentation in a way that just like, yeah, D&D gets all the credit. It's the game. It's the big game. It's the world's greatest, world's first. More people play it than, you know, anything else, right? But like all of the really rich, interesting ideas that aren't D&D, Chaosium almost always has like some sort of finger in it, or like you could trace the DNA in some way. Like Vampire the Masquerade, Chaosium facilitates that. The Star Wars role-playing game, Chaosium facilitates that. All the Year Zero games from Free League, there is Chaosium DNA in that. There are ducks in Free League games because of Chaosium. Like all of these things are like interconnected. I don't understand why Chaosium isn't more beloved and welcomed into people's game tables. It's so astounding to me that there's such a popularity disparity between D&D and literally everything else.
Hey man, it's called a much better marketing budget.
Yeah, and it really comes down to like being out there first and having that little bit of advantage, they've leveraged that forever.
Well, there you go. Do you have any final thoughts on all the world's monsters?
People in our Discord joke about the stew effect and how, like, we put out an episode of the pod.
Did it again. You're spending your cash at our noble night. There are sponsors. Yeah.
Like, all of a sudden, there's going to be a run on every copy of All the World's Monsters on eBay because we did an episode on it, and the prices are going to go up. They're really not that great. I love Chaosium products and all, but like, these sit on my shelf and they take up space. I look through them every once in a while and I'm just like, man, these aren't that awesome. So like, if you are a victim of the stew effect, in this case, I really question the need for you to put these ones on your shelves.
Well, there you go. Folks, this is another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG podcast, and thankfully, not one that we did twice. So here on that, everybody. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG. I don't think I've ever actually posted these, so maybe I'll get on that.
There's always room for more content, Stu.
It's true. I mean, we've got years ahead of me still. God help me.
There you go. You can find me on Instagram at John McGuire RPG, on Twitter at John McGuire RPG as well. I'm going to post. I will. I got to promote Rocket to Russia, so you're going to see me more. I'll be on the internet more. And if you want to catch up anytime, you can find me on our Discord. We have a great Discord community for everybody, but we have an even better Discord community for our patrons, patreon.com/vintagerpg. Besides the patron community, we've got early release episodes. We've got some behind-the-scenes videos. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points, and my RPG 3-2-1 Action presents Rocket to Russia, patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.